Hello, in this video we're going to talk about the advanced firmware for the Skywatcher Star Adventure Star Tracker, what it is, how to install it, and what you can do with it. So let's get started. Alright, so the advanced firmware is basically just an alternative firmware that you can download from the official Skywatcher website, and you can load it up onto your Skywatcher Star Adventure. This is an official package, and even if you read the manual for the standard version of the firmware, on some last page you get a notice that, hey, by the way, there is an advanced firmware which you can load up to your Star Adventure, and there's a whole other PDF and manual on how to use the advanced firmware. So long story short, it basically introduces 2 new modes for the Star Adventure and also 5 configurable parameters that you can set for your unit and use it for your creative needs. And because this is quite a substantial change in the operating modes, there's actually a new layout of the mode dial. As you can see, I have already replaced mine. There's a new layout of the mode dial, and if you want to replace it, which I will show you how to do in just a second, you can just download the manual for the advanced firmware from the Skywatcher website, which, by the way, everything will be linked down below in the description. Links to Skywatcher website and everything that you need to know will be also delineated in detail in the description of this video. So you can basically download this PDF, and on the first page of this PDF there is a new layout for the mode dial which you can print out and replace, which I will show you in just a moment, like I mentioned. But first we need to actually update our Skywatcher Star Adventure to the new firmware. So in order to do that, we're going to need a computer, and we're going to need either a USB cable if you have the original Star Adventure like I do. Right here, as you can see, there is a mini USB port, and you can use your mini USB to USB Type A or USB Type C cable and connect it to your computer. If you have the Star Adventure version 2i, which has the built-in Wi-Fi, then you can also do the update of the firmware using Wi-Fi. And in order to download the new firmware, you have to head over to this website and download the firmware. And in order to actually load it up onto your unit, you also need a software called a Motor Loader Controller or something like this. And this software will allow you to actually load up the firmware onto your Skywatcher Star Adventure tracking unit. And this software is only for Windows, but don't worry, I actually have a Macintosh and you can also do that on macOS. And in order to do that, you just need to download VirtualBox, which is a free software from Oracle that you can head over to the official Microsoft website and download the ISO image of a Windows 10, for instance. This is what I did. I downloaded Windows 10, the 32-bit version, and this is not like you need to go to some kind of a shady website. You can download it from the official Microsoft website, and when you install it in VirtualBox, which is like a virtual machine that you can run inside macOS, you can just choose that you don't have a serial key and you will run some kind of an evaluation version of Windows or whatever, but for our needs we just need to run it for like 10 minutes or something, so this will definitely do. I don't want to bore you with details on how to pull it off on macOS, because if you're a Windows user, obviously this doesn't apply to you. But if you're a macOS user like I am, I will list some detailed information and links to relevant articles that I followed down below in the description, so you can do that also. So once you have everything downloaded and you have your Skywatcher Star Adventure connected to your laptop, you just need to load up the software to update the firmware, choose the appropriate port and then hit load. It will take a couple of minutes, and while it does, you will see the left and right arrows on the Star Adventure flashing, and that's an indication that the firmware is actually being loaded. And also you can see some kind of a progress down below in this window, and once it's done, you can disconnect everything, you can close the program, disconnect everything, and you have the advanced firmware loaded up to your Star Adventure. And right now it's a good idea to replace the mode dial if everything went successful with the update, so you don't get confused when you use your Star Adventure as to in which mode you actually are. So in order to replace the mode dial, you're gonna have to take the Allen key of size 2, which is a pretty thin one, and then make sure to have the mode dial on the off position, and then somewhere along the edge of the mode dial you will see this tiny little screw, and you have to use your Allen key of size 2 to actually unscrew it. And if you unscrew it all the way, then you can just lift up the mode dial and you can take it off the Star Adventure. And right now you have to actually remove the layout of the modes from the actual dial. In order to do that, you can just press with the Allen key or whatever other tool you have, press it through some of those openings and it will let go. It is being glued by some kind of an adhesive, but it's just a very light adhesive, so you will definitely have no problem removing the old mode dial. And then, like I said, you will need to take the printout of the first page of the Advanced Firmware manual and you will have to cut it out. But as you can see, when I lined it up, it turned out that actually the mode dial on the printout is a little bit too large. And that was kind of a bummer because I specifically told my printer to print it at scale of 100% because I thought that Skywatcher would put it inside the PDF to print it out at the scale of 100% so it's not confusing, but it turns out that that is not the case. So what I did is I took a very professional measuring device, I don't know even how this is called in English. I measured up the size of the original mode dial, I measured the size of the mode dial on my printout, and I figured out using very simple math that I need to print it out with the scale of 91.2%. And I did it, and it lined up perfectly. So if you want to do it for yourself, make sure to print out the first page of the manual at exactly the scale of 91.2%. My printer actually didn't want to accept decimals in the scale for the printout, so I just input 91% and it worked perfectly. So another thing that I did before actually cutting out the new mode dial is I taped it using a Scotch tape because I figured that a piece of paper could easily get damaged, because if you use your Star Adventure during a cold night and then you bring it into a warm car on a warm apartment, you will get some condensation on pretty much everything that is cold. And if you get droplets of condensation on a piece of paper, well, you know what's gonna happen. So what I did is I actually covered it up with some strips of the Scotch tape, and that way it will protect it from the condensation, even if a little bit. So after doing that on both sides, I cut it out carefully using a pair of scissors and then confirm that everything is lining up correctly. Then the other thing that is left to do is to actually cut out a hole in the middle so that the bolt on the Star Adventure could actually go through this mode dial. So in order to do that, I used just a sharp knife, and with a little bit of fiddling I was able to cut out this hole. And then if you want to put it back together, you need to make sure that you align everything correctly with the mode dial. So you need to make sure that the off position on the mode dial is lining up with the mode indicator on the Star Adventure. And also you need to make sure that the place for the screw on the actual mode dial is lining up with this notch on the bolt right here on the Star Adventure. So I don't know if this is the case for every unit, but in my unit I needed the moon/A indicator on the mode dial to align with the position of the screw. So once I aligned everything correctly, I just needed to put in place this piece of paper on the actual this black mode dial, and to do that I just used some strips of Scotch tape. You can use some kind of adhesive, whatever you want to make it stick together and not turn inside it independently. So once you do that, you just need to put everything back together, screw in the Allen key, and voila, you have your new mode dial on the Skywatcher Star Adventure, which looks something like this, and you can start using the new modes. Alright, so now let's get to the good stuff and let's talk about the new modes, and let's talk about the 5 configurable parameters, because this really unlocks a whole new world of potential for the unit that you already have. Alright, so obviously the first mode that we are at right now is the off position, and that is just the position that the tracker is turned off. And if we rotate it down, the first mode is, as you can see, the indication is star/D. And this is just a sidereal tracking mode, so if you just want to take photos of the stars and if you want to track with regards to the Earth's rotation so the stars are sharp in your photos, that's the mode that you should use. And the /D means that this mode also has a secondary mode, and the D stands for defaults, and that is used if you want to reset the 5 configurable parameters to the factory defaults. And in order to do that, you just need to have this mode activated, and then you have to press those 2 arrows, press it down and hold it for 5 seconds, and then just switch the mode to anything else, and then the 5 configurable parameters, which I'm going to cover in just a second, are being reset to defaults. Alright, so let's switch to the other mode. This mode, as you can see, is indicated by an icon of the sun/N. And this is the solar tracking speed, so if you want to take photos of the sun and have it nice and sharp in your photos, that's the mode that you should use. And this of course corresponds to the solar tracking mode from the standard firmware. And then the /N on this mode indicates that this also has a secondary mode, and the N stands for number of photos to take. So if you are taking photos using the snap port right here on the Star Adventure, if you're doing that, Then you can configure how many photos do you want to take, either for a time lapse or for a session of taking photos of the stars. I just normally leave it at 0, and if you leave it at 0, it will just take photos indefinitely. Then the next mode is indicated by an icon of the moon /A, and this is of course the primary mode. In this position is the lunar tracking speed, so if you want to take photos of the moon, this is the mode that you should use. And the /A means that this has a secondary mode, and the secondary mode is to configure the angle. The A stands for angle, and this means that if you're taking time lapses, you can configure what kind of an angle do you want your star adventure to cover. So for instance, you can set it to 90 degrees and it will go 90 degrees to one side and then turn around, and then turn around again, 90, 90, and turn around like this. And this makes a very cool way to customize how you take your time lapses, because usually you don't want your camera to turn around 360 degrees, because what is interesting for a time lapse is usually in front of you. So you can configure how big of a range of angle do you want the star adventure to cover if you're using it for time lapses. Obviously, if you're using it for sidereal tracking or something, it will take no effect. So the next mode, as you can see, it says int, and in this mode the star adventure is not rotating at all, and this is only used to configure the parameter of interval. So the 5 configurable parameters that I was mentioning since the beginning of the video, the 2 you already know, the number of photos and then the angle. This is the third one, and this is the interval, and this just indicates the interval in seconds between each consecutive shots, again if you're doing time lapses and if you're using the built-in snap port to release the shutter in your camera. So this is the interval. And then the next one is exposure, and this could be used for both taking photos of the stars, so for instance for sidereal tracking mode, and it also could be used in one of the time-lapse modes. So I'm going to talk in detail about the 2 time-lapse modes in just a second, but you can use this parameter in order to take photos of the stars. And this is, I was a little bit skeptical at first, because I figured, well, I could just use my remote intervalometer that I normally use and take photos like this. I don't need the snap port, I don't need to configure this. But this is actually very, very convenient, because literally I don't need to worry about my external intervalometer. I don't need to worry about whether it's charged. I don't need to worry about whether it doesn't break during the shoot. I can just set it. I can just set the exposure time for each individual shot if I'm taking photos of the stars, and then I can just use the snap port. And by the way, the snap port is a 2.5mm mini jack, and I have this cable right here, and you can just connect it here. One end goes right here, and then the other one goes to the camera, and what the port is on the other side of this cable is going to be dependent on what camera do you have. I have the Canon EOS R, and on the EOS R it also accepts a micro jack. This is not the 3.5 mini jack, the one that you would use on like most of the headphones. This is a smaller and thinner one. This is called a micro jack, 2.5mm thick. This is the cable that you need. Right, and let's get back to our mode. So this is the exposure mode, and then we have 2 more modes. So the 2 more modes right here are the new modes that you can use to actually use your star adventure. So this one is used to either configure the velocity. The V stands for velocity, and it basically just means how fast the star adventure is turning when it is being used for time lapses. And also in this mode, it actually is the mode for time lapses. I don't know why they didn't use the same convention as with these modes, where you have, for instance, star/D, sun/N, and moon/A. They should have named it something /V to indicate that in this position you have a primary mode of time-lapse and then a secondary mode of configuring the speed of rotation, but you just have to remember that. So this is the mode for time-lapses, which I will cover in just a second. But also in this mode you can configure the speed of rotation of the right ascension axis here on your star adventure. And then the last position is one of the new modes that I am very excited about. This is called the Astro time-lapse. And the Astro time-lapse is something that I am very excited about, and basically in this mode it is used to take a very high quality time-lapse of the stars that are washing across the sky. So normally if you want to do that, you would set your camera stationary so that you are pointing at the same position of the sky with regards to the ground objects, and then you would just take some exposures, long exposures with an intervalometer, and then have it running for like an hour, 2 or 3 or something. and that way you can create a cool time lapse of like Milky Way rising or setting or something like this. But the problem with that, if you have your camera stationary and you're recording time lapse like this, it's that you are limited by the rule of 500, so that you don't have any star trace. But if you wanted to use a star tracker traditionally, if you just turned it on in the sidereal tracking, yes, for every exposure you would have pinpoint stars, even for long exposures like a couple of minutes long, but obviously you would be just continuously tracking the sky and the ground would just change position with regards to the sky, and that is not what you want typically if you want to capture the time lapse of just stars washing across the sky. So that's where the new Astro time-lapse mode comes in. And in this mode, what the Star Adventure actually does, if you turn it on in this mode, what it does is that it will take a photo that lasts, the exposure lasts the number of seconds that you can set using the exposure right here, the parameter that I will show you how to configure in just a second. And during the exposure, it will track the sky so that the stars are pinpoint sharp, and then before it takes another exposure, it automatically rolls back, it automatically goes back to the initial position of the right ascension axis, and then it takes another exposure. So each consecutive exposure is always starting from the same position, from the same spot in the sky with regards to the ground, and it is tracked. So you can use exposure times of like 2-3 minutes or something like this, and then you get a very high quality time lapse. And at the same time, the ground stays in the exact same position, because after each exposure that is tracked with the speed of sidereal tracking, it is automatically rolling back to the original position before taking the next shot. I hope I made it somewhat clear. If not, hit me up in the comments, or you can just refer to the manual of the Advanced Firmware and read it up. They have some nice charts and some nice explanation about all of those modes and how it works. But this is something I am very excited about. I need to go out in the field and try this for myself. And if you want to see how to do that, because obviously there is a little bit of trickery in post-production involved with this, because for each shot the ground will be blurry, so you either need to take a static shot of the ground and then sandwich it together with the time-lapse, or maybe you just need to record the time-lapse of the ground afterwards, or maybe you can just use two cameras and simultaneously record the time-lapse of the sky with the Star Adventure and then the time-lapse of the ground that is just stationary on a tripod, and then blend everything together in After Effects. I will be doing that. I will be showing you how to do that. So if you want to see how to do it, now is a good time to probably subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I will definitely be making a lot more videos about the adventure and about the new mode, so yeah, I think you won't regret it. Alright, so now that we have the Astro time-lapse mode covered, let's cover the new time-lapse mode, because actually on the V position you have two different time-lapse modes that you can activate and also configure the speed, which I mentioned before. So if you switch to that, it will activate one of the two time-lapse modes, and depending on what is the value of your exposure, it will either be a short exposure time-lapse, just a regular time-lapse, and in this mode the Star Adventure is just rotating continuously, and every interval amount of seconds it will release the shutter, and that is used to just take a regular time-lapse, short exposure time-lapse during the day of like clouds or whatever you want. But also you can have a long exposure time-lapse. And in order to enable the long exposure time-lapse, you need to have the exposure value, exposure parameter, to set something else than 0. If the exposure value is set to 0 seconds, then it will be a regular time-lapse, and if it's set to something else than 0, it will be a long exposure time-lapse. And the long exposure time-lapse is also pretty clever, because what it does is basically it doesn't rotate continuously like with short exposure time-lapse, but for the time that it takes the exposure, it actually stops. So what it does is that it rotates a little bit, then it stops, then it takes the exposure, which could be like, I don't know, 10 seconds long or something like this, and then between that and the next shot it rotates a little bit. So it rotates, then it stops, 10 seconds of an exposure, let's say, rotates a little bit, 10 seconds of an exposure, rotates a little bit, 10 seconds, a little bit, 10 seconds, etc, etc. And this is a very cool mode. I will be testing it out myself as well and probably making a separate video about it, so yeah, definitely subscribe if you haven't already. And in this mode, they say that it's very useful to create, for instance, a nighttime time-lapse in the city where you have like light trails of cars passing by and you have a time-lapse of like panning across like a highway or something like this. Very cool effects could be achieved in this mode. I also cannot wait to test it out. Alright, so right now it's probably a good idea to show you guys how you can actually configure those 5 configurable parameters. So let's start with exposure. in order to configure the amount of seconds for an exposure, for long exposure, either for sidereal tracking or for long exposure time-lapse, just switch the mode dial to X, and then in order to configure the value of the exposure, you have to turn around your Star Adventure, and then you have to use the three-way switcher, the hemisphere switcher, as time-lapse and N. It has 3 positions, and also those left and right arrows. So the way it works for every of the configurable parameter is that depending on the position of this switch, you can configure 3 different digits, and it always looks like this. So the most significant digit is always on the leftmost position, which is S, and the number of times it blinks before a pause is the value of this digit. So for the exposure, it is in seconds, so you can configure on the S position, you can configure the hundreds of seconds. On the middle position, the time-lapse here with this switch, you can configure the tens of seconds. And then on the rightmost, on the N position, you can configure the single seconds. So if it blinks once on the S, it means I have the value of 100 set as my exposure. And then if I switch it to time-lapse, which is the middle position, as you can see, it blinks twice and then it has a pause. Once, twice, pause. Once, twice, pause. And then on the N, it doesn't blink at all, so it means that the value for my current exposure parameter is 120 seconds. And if you want to change it, it's very easily. For instance, if I wanted to have it at 130 seconds, I would just move the switcher to the digit that I want to change, and then just use these arrows. You can use the right arrow to increase it, and then the left arrow to decrease it. So if I click once here, it now blinks 3 times. 1, 2, 3. So the current value of the exposure is 130 seconds. And if I want to commit this change so it is actually saved by the Star Adventure, I just need to switch the mode to anything else. And if I switch back, it will remember it. So again, blinks 3 times. So it is 1, then 3, and then 0. So it is 130. So if I have this as my exposure and if I use the time-lapse mode, it will be doing a long exposure time-lapse. But if I switch the exposure value to 0, so let's do that. So again, exposure, and then we are going to move it to 0. So 3 times here, and then as you can see, it doesn't blink at all. Then if I move here, it blinks once, so let's reset that to 0 again. So I have 0 for all of the 3 digits. And then if I commit that, if I move to time-lapse, it will start rotating continuously, because this is the short exposure time-lapse, and in this mode it just continuously rotates. And this continuously rotating mode is actually something that made me update to the advanced firmware on the Skywatcher Star Adventure, because I wanted to do something creative and I wanted to attach a long steel pipe to my Skywatcher Star Adventure and use it as a motor to actually move my camera in an orbit to create this awesome kind of time-lapse of me messing with my camera, and then I have a motorized rig of a camera that is doing an orbit around my hands while I do stuff to kind of show it off on a video. And this is, of course, this has nothing to do with like astrophotography or anything like this. This is just to show you guys what creative things you can achieve using a device that you probably already own if you're watching this video, and you can do really very creative stuff. If you're doing any kind of videos or time lapses, then you can definitely get creative with these modes. So basically, for all of these 5 parameters that you can configure on the Skywatcher Star Adventure, the procedure is the same. So that if you want to configure them, you have the 3-way switch, and the leftmost position is the most significant digit, the middle position is the middle digit, and the rightmost position is the least significant digit. And depending on the parameter that you configure, the unit of those numbers is different. So for the exposure, it is seconds. And for instance, if you want to configure the angle, which would be right here, this would be degrees. So let's actually do that, because in this mode it is a little bit different, because depending on if a mode is dedicated only to changing a parameter like interval or exposure, you don't need to do anything special. You can just right away start configuring the parameter using these arrows and the 3-way switch. But if a mode has a primary and a secondary mode, for instance this one right here is lunar tracking or configuring the angle. So if you just want to track the moon, then you just switch to this position and you can track the moon. But if you want to configure the angle on your Star Adventure, then you're going to have to long press those 2 arrows for 5 seconds. So let me just do that. If you long press them, it will count. twice, 3, 4, 5, and then you can let it go. After 5 seconds of holding them down, you are in the configuration mode. And as you can see on the end, it doesn't blink, so I have 0 here. If I go to the middle, it will blink 6 times, and that is the value of 6, so I have 6 and 0. And then for the leftmost position, it blinks 3 times, so the value of the angle is 360 degrees. And then of course, after changing the parameter, if you want, you can commit the change by just switching the mode dial to anything else. And you can look it up in the manual what those 3 digits means for every of those modes that you can configure. For instance, for the rotation speed, if I go to V and enable the configuration mode, again, the V has a primary mode of time-lapse and a secondary mode of configuring the speed. So I would need to hold it down both of these buttons for 5 seconds to enable the configuration mode. Then the digit would mean something else. The speed is actually defined by the amount of time that it takes to complete a full rotation around the RA axis. So the leftmost is the tenths of hours, the middle position is the hours, and then the right position is the tenths of minutes. Let me just go to here and then long press. And now I'm in the configuration mode. So as you can see on the leftmost, I have 0. So I have 0 tenths of hours. I have also 0 hours. And I have 2 of tenths of minutes. So it takes 20 minutes to complete a full rotation. And again, this speed is only relevant for time lapses. If you're doing any kind of sidereal tracking or lunar tracking or solar tracking, of course, the speed of the rotation will be defined by the speed of rotation of those celestial bodies. So you don't need to worry about that. So as you can see, there's a lot of stuff to configure, and the 2 new modes are very exciting, at least for me. I will be definitely trying them out. One last thing that I wanted to mention is that if you're going to use the snap port in order to release the shutter, and if you're doing like a long exposure time-lapse or an Astro time-lapse, you definitely need to do that, because this needs to be in sync with like rolling back to the original position for the Astro time-lapse, or actually pausing the rotation for the long exposure time-lapse. But if you want to use that for just regular sidereal tracking and taking photos of the stars, I recently tried doing that. I set it to 120 seconds to take 2-minute exposures, but the actual exposures, when I looked it up in Lightroom, were 118 seconds, so it was like 2 seconds less. And I also was doing some tests with shutter exposures of like 5 to 10 seconds, and I found out that usually the actual exposure time on the bulb mode on the camera is going to be somewhat around 2 seconds less than what you set it on the Star Adventure. And on top of that, it might be a little bit inconsistent. So for instance, if you use the exposure time of 5 seconds, you will end up with exposures of like 3.4 seconds, 3.6, 3.8, 3.2, something like this. And at first I was thinking that, wow, that's completely useless. But honestly, if you're doing exposure times of like 2 minutes, and if it's 2 seconds short, and even if it's a little bit inconsistent, if it's 2 seconds or 1 second short, it is not really that noticeable. And if you're really paranoid about having exactly the same exposure, you can just sync it up in Lightroom. Lightroom actually has an option to match the exposure, so you can just select everything and then click this match exposure button, and it will take a look at the exposure times, the value of the ISO and aperture and everything, and it will equalize the brightness using the exposure slider. And bear in mind that this equalization will be very, very minimal. And honestly, I was photographing the Heart Nebula just a couple of nights ago, and I didn't even do this exposure matching in Lightroom. I just used the 118 seconds long exposures. I stacked it using serial, I edited it, and the image turned out to be just fine. So you can definitely do it, and this is something that I will be definitely doing, because using the snap port is actually very convenient, because I don't need to worry about my external intervalometer, I don't need to charge its batteries, I don't need to worry about replacing the batteries or whatever. It is just less hassle overall. So I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please make sure to leave it a thumbs up down below. I would really appreciate it. And also, like I mentioned, consider subscribing to my channel, because I will be making more videos about the new modes on the Star Adventure, and also about astrophotography in general and photography in general as well. So it's definitely worth subscribing. And right now, in the meantime, you can check out these 2 videos. I think you will find them very interesting, and hopefully see you next time. Clear skies and bye bye.